Welcome back. My name is Jack Burgess. This time I'm going to do something a little different. I've been thinking that over the years I've learned a lot of tricks and ways of doing things from other modelers, especially modelers when I was young, modelers that were older than me. So I thought this time what I would do is talk about a bunch of different things, things that worked out really well that I did, things that didn't work out so well. The first thing I want to talk about is layout design. Some of this I talked about in the video on multi-deck layouts, but one of the things I did when I designed my layout was I really wanted to have a long distance between switching locations. A lot of designers will say, I want to make sure that the main line is long enough that when I enter another town, I don't have the caboose in the previous town. My prototype, the Yosemite Valley Railroad, is a little different in that there was a town at the beginning at Merced. El Portel, not much of a town. Had a store, some houses, and so forth. But in between, Merced Falls was a company town, but there were no other towns. Bagby, I've modeled Bagby, and I modeled just about every building in town, and there's only half a dozen of them. So it's not a situation of getting into one town and having a caboose somewhere else. But what I was able to do is stretch things so much that when you pull into Bagby, you've gone through a 180-degree turn and you're on a different side of the room. And that's how it is for a lot of the places on the layout, that there's just scenery. No buildings. Maybe there were some buildings there, but I didn't model them. I want the operator to feel like they're running through just foothills and not a big crowded metropolis. So that has worked out really well. As I've mentioned many times, I don't operate my own layout, but I really enjoy having people here and watching them enjoy the layout and get the sense that they're actually running a real railroad back in 1939. One of the challenges I had when I started this layout is we're in a garage, 20 by 20 garage. We don't have basements in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. If we had a basement into this house, it would be full of water. The water table is so low here, or so shallow. But I was only renting this house, and I was renting it from people I knew, and he'd gotten another job and wanted to move closer to where he was working, and asked if I'd like to rent this house. And the condition was, don't call him. You can rent the house, but don't call me unless the water heater goes out. And so once they moved out, they never saw this house again. But I assumed that I would eventually have to move the layout. And as an engineer, design engineer, so what I did is the whole entire layout is not attached to the walls. It's sitting about an inch or so in from the walls, because my thought was, what if I move it to another garage and the carpenters cheated a little bit and it didn't fit? So ultimately we bought the house. We own the house now. So that was kind of you could call it a waste of effort, but it might be something you might think about if you are in a situation where you know you're going to have to move, is don't make things so long that you're not going to be able to fit them somehow into another space. Another thing that worked out really well is these armrests. This layout has 3 of them, and my thought was I had two purposes. One is if I get in a situation where 1 or 2 guys come over to see the layout, this space is a good place to stand and talk about things, explain things, and they can, just like in a bar, you can lean on the armrest. I actually had them on a previous layout, and that previous layout was a test bed. When I got back into the hobby in about 65 or so, I built a little 2x6 switching layout, kind of, followed by a more complicated switching layout. And then I moved to this house, and I built a layout around 3 sides of the garage. My wife at that time, not my current wife, insisted that we park the car in the garage. And so that one was a test bed. I built part of the bench work with L-girder, part of it with traditional grid. What was the advantage of one over the other? I tried different things, ways of making rock castings. What worked, what didn't work. What worked for making or duplicating yellow grass, golden grass. So that layout was never intended to be a final layout. It only ran around 3 sides of the garage and was a test bed. And I kept it for quite a while, to the point where I finally felt my skills in hand laying track, building turnouts, doing scenery were sufficient that I could embark on a lifetime project, which is what this is. As far as things I would do differently, as far as layout design, one is aisle width. This isn't too bad, but behind me is a very narrow aisle, and 2 people cannot pass. You have to, one person has to go and then the other person. Even worse is on the other side by Merced Falls, it's a dead end. And at the end of an operating session, as shown on the operating video, there's a 3-way meet. That means 3 engineers are trying to be in that same space. But I don't know if I would have done anything different in hindsight because I just don't have the room. I'm shoved into a 20 by 20 space. In fact, there is a space over to my right that I did not use. It was apparently designed for people to have a workbench in their garage. But I've also been told by building inspectors that you can't have a workbench in your garage. Our water heater and our washer and dryer in the house, so they were not for that space. If I had bought this house and started the layout, I would have used that space. And so that would have been nice, but I just, been in a situation where I might have to move, and having that space available just wouldn't be possible. I mentioned that this layout was designed to be moved. What I did to facilitate that is I built the layout in sections that were bolted together so that I could come back later, take out the bolts, cut through the scenery and the roadbed, and be able to move the sections. I also called a moving van company and found out the width of the inside of a moving vehicle, because if I move this layout, it's not going to be moved on the back of a pickup and have all the scenery blow out on the freeway. So this center section is designed so that it could be cut apart, slid out the door, and moved to another location if needed. One thing I want to talk about is the grades here, which is embarrassing because, as I've mentioned many times, I was a civil engineer and I designed the grades. And I had designed the grades around the whole layout, and a lot of it looks like it's level, but it just climbs very slowly and then comes back down because I had to be, this grade had to be the same as the one on the other side in order to be able to get to the second level, from the first level to the second level. But in this area, I had my roadbed all laid out and bolted in place. The fascia was all cut and screwed in place. I started laying tracks, and I suddenly realized I was steeper than I could. I have a maximum of 2.3% grade on the layout, and that is based on the locomotives I had available, how many cars I was going to run, and so that was just not going to work out. So I had to raise all of this track, or roadbed, in order to get where I needed to be. And so now I got the fascia down here, the roadbed up here. The only solution was to put all this rock cliff. And I've had guests come over and say, God, rock work is just great. And I'm going, it's because I messed up. The only reason I have rocks here. There shouldn't be rocks here. And around the corner, it's even worse because I have a station. I wanted to model the river. And so you have this rock face that's this tall. In reality, it wasn't there. But so I wish I would have not put the fascia in. I think that would have been the solution, is don't put the fascia in until you've got everything planned, you know it's going to work. Now, one thing that also is kind of disappointing here, we have some log cars sitting here. The original log cars I had Katy trucks under them. And so they could sit here and they didn't move anywhere. Well, when I built these, I used Tahoe Model Works trucks that are very free rolling. And so if you move these will take off, and they're going past the fouling point. Some days they roll all the way down under the main line. So what I've had to do is I've taken a piece of real fine chain, like 60 links per inch, and I've laid it across the track right here, and that keeps the cars from rolling. So another thing I think I did that worked out really well, going back and forth, is I hand laid all my track. And as I've mentioned before, at the time when I started this lat, I could not afford flex track. But I hear people saying and maybe it's layouts that are much bigger, but they're always having derailments during operating sessions. I do not have derailments. I laid all the track, gauging it as I went, so all of it's in gauge. You've got wooden ties that are glued to homosode, and I spike about every fifth tie. So that rail is not going to move. If it was engaged when I built it 30 years ago, it's still engaged. Same way with the turnouts. The turnouts are all hand laid. I'll tell you a couple things I wish I had done different, but I don't have derailments at them. In fact, when I was laying the track, I didn't even add guardrails until sometimes years and years later, and I was operating trains because I was exactly engaged on each side of the frog. And if you're engaged there, you don't need a guardrail to keep from splitting the switch. So I think hand laying track was really a good idea. When I was doing it, I enjoyed it, and it was interesting that I hand laid all the stuff on the bottom level and then started at the top. And when I started scenery, I suddenly realized I couldn't see under here anymore. And now that I'm much older, if I do have to do something, and I rarely do, but if I did, it's kind of tough to get to and take care of. So I'm fortunate both ways. I did it right the first time, and it's staying right. So that was, I think, a very good choice. As I said, I really didn't have a choice because I couldn't do it any other way, but it worked out really well. Another thing I did was I incorporated spiral curves in all of the track. And spiral curves are shown in this illustration. One way to do it is you have a regular radius, and then you take a couple of pieces of a larger radius and use that to transition to the tangent or straight track. Railroads always use spiral curves. Every single curve on a prototype railroad is a spiral curve. Roadways are another factor. I was a civil engineer, as I mentioned. I designed roadways, and the California Department of Transportation prohibits spiral curves on their roads. The problem is on a spiral curve, the advantage of a spiral curve is the train starts around it, is it starts a very slow turn, and then it gets sharper to what your minimum radius is, and then it does the same thing coming out of the curve. If you were driving, you'd be driving along, you turn the steering wheel a little bit, and all of a sudden you have to turn it more to keep on the road. So that's why design engineers for streets don't use them. What I was able to do is Andy Sparandio had an article in Model Railroader about the time even before I was designing my layout, and they had a full-size spiral curve template that started at tangent and was a spiral curve to a larger radius and smaller and smaller, so it would fit just about any situation. I cut those out, mounted them on cardstock, and used them to lay out all of my track. Now, when you look at the track from eye level, you don't see the spiral curves. I know where they are, and I notice when your tangent, I keep saying tangent, that means straight track, tangent, and then it's very gradual, and then it's the minimum radius. And the minimum radius I have here is 22 inches. That's pretty sharp by current standards, but I also don't have a huge basement. And I had a magazine that John Armstrong wrote, and what he suggested is you take your longest wheelbase locomotive, especially if you're steam, and that you need to accommodate that one. And so with 260s, they would run on a 22-inch radius curve without a problem. But a 280 probably wouldn't make it. So that's how I came up with the 22 as a recommendation of John Armstrong. I have number 5 switches, and that was another one that he said, if you've got a 22-inch radius, no use having number 10 switches because you're just taking up more real estate. So 5, the curve through a number 5 switch is equal to a 22-inch radius. So those match. So the standards match. I'll show you what I wish I would have done a little bit different, but that's where my standards came from. And for me, the spiral curves really are worth doing it. And one way to, what the traditional way to do it is not what I did, using a mathematical model, is you take maybe a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch piece of wood, maybe a little bit bigger, and you lay it along your tangent and your curve, and as you bend it, you will automatically get a variation of a spiral curve, and use that to line it out. What I did when I was drawing up my layout, and I drew up all the plans in CAD before I started work, because I was wanting to make sure everything was going to fit. So it wasn't one of these, well, I'll try this, and if it works, if it doesn't work, I'll rip it out and so forth. And so what I did, you can't draw a spiral curve when you're working on a scale drawing of your track plan. You won't see it. But what I did is, if I wanted a 22-inch radius curve, I drew it as a 24-inch radius curve. That gave me a little bit of slop so I can get to 22 and have spirals on both ends, if that makes sense. I mentioned I hand-laid all of my turnouts. So these were some of the very first ones I built. These are all built to NORA standards as far as the distance between the points and the frog. The one problem I had was I didn't have a router at the time, and so I actually had to use a saw or something to cut underneath the roadbed or through the roadbed to mount the switch motor. And I'll show you the switch motors I used in a minute. If I could afford a router at the time, I would have made these slots so that you couldn't see anything. So I see them now, and I think I'm to the point where I don't notice them as much. But I wished I had done it differently, had come up with something else. On a previous layout, I drilled through the roadbed back here and then had a wire come up and bent, and so the wire would throw them this way. It's totally not prototype, so I went to this solution. So this is the El Portel section of my layout. This was built, maybe a decade or more after I'd finished all the other track work when I found I had more space. And in the meantime, Tony Custer had mentioned to me that either an idea or something he was doing is that if you have a number 5 switch, rather than having the points way up here, you just push the points further down the line. And it makes the whole thing look a lot smoother. It looks more prototype. Still a number 5, but you look at this and you say, that must be a number 10 switch because the points are so far apart. You're not losing space because you're still going off at the sharp angle of a number 5. So I wished I had known this when I built the rest of the layout. I would have done this. Another thing I learned after I got command control and their operators were more experienced and so forth, is on the rest of the layout, I might have the gaps for that frog, maybe way up here. It didn't make any difference. Well, now what happens with command control and people more knowledgeable, I have to warn operators, if you want to come in and drop your head and brakeman off to throw the switch, you've got to watch where this frog is or where the gaps are, because if you cross the gaps without throwing the switch, you're going to short out. They don't do it now, but I was riding a train, it was a freight train, and a friend of mine was the conductor, and he invited me to ride along for the day. So I thought I was just going to take pictures. Well, what they were doing is they had me get off the engine and throw the switches, but they would come up and bring the engine up maybe this far, and then I would get off, and so I had a shorter distance to walk, and everything got done quicker. So we can't do that, but having the gaps close to the frog is better. Now, another thing I would like to mention is what I did is the frog is isolated, and it is fed by a toggle switch. When you throw the switch, it reverses polarity of the frog. So the frog is not getting polarity or power from the points. This point is hardwired to that stock rail. This one is hardwired to that stock rail. So the advantage is you're not relying on the points to come in contact with the stock rail to feed the frog. It's all done through the toggle switch. I mentioned previously that I had a prior layout that was kind of a test bed. One of the things I did on that layout was explore ways that I could have operators feel more like they were really running a train. And so instead of having electric switches for the turnouts, I actually made little switch stands about this tall that were functional. They were mounted along the front of the layout, and to throw a switch, you actually lifted the lever, rotated it 90 degrees, and dropped it down. So when I started this layout, it was not practical to continue to do that, but I wanted to have the points move over slowly, not snap. And so the solution was these motors. These motors were made by Hanks Craft. The motors were not designed for model railroaders, but for displays in grocery stores that might have a hand moving or wine bottles rocking back and forth. So they're very well-made, long-lasting motors. I think it was the person that started Intrac that suggested using these motors. And so what I did, this is one of the insulation for when I started, I mounted them vertically. There's a couple of spacers up there to drop the motor down below the underside of the layout. And when you throw the motor, this handle moves over. And that threw the switch, and it was nice and slow. The problem was you had to order these from the factory, and the minimum order was 100 motors at $5 a pop. That was a lot of money in those days for me. So I saved up my money. I didn't need 100. I bought 100, sold 25 of them at cost to a friend of mine, and continued to install them like this. Then a round-robin letter that I had with Tony Custer and several other modelers, Tony mentioned that he was mounting them horizontally with a pipe clamp. And what he meant was a clamp that looked like a U that you would use to bolt a pipe up against a wall or under something. What I thought he was talking about is these, which are really hose clamps for hooking your radiator hose up to the radiator. So I started doing this and mentioned it to Tony, and then he said, aha, that's a lot easier. And so the only thing you have to do is make sure you get it in the right spot that the wire will go up, and drill a hole through the clamp, screw it underneath, slide it in. You can slide it back and forth once you get it in, tighten it up, and hook it up. So these then move this way. Very, very simple. They're very quiet. I've had one on the layout for at least 40 years now, maybe. I've never had one of these motors go out. I thought I had a couple times. I would throw the toggle back and forth. The motor's not moving. It's got to be the motor, right? No, the toggles failed. The motor was fine. Another thing that I would do differently is when I started the layout, the standard was, of course, Katy couplers and under the tie uncoupling ramps, permanent magnets. And so I did that. And I didn't have a router, but I would allow for it, and I had ramps all these into these spur tracks. I had them marked, but when operators would come over, I would point those out, but while they're trying to run a train, they didn't use them. And so instead they would reach in with a little pick, which is what we still do, uncouple, and then they might pull out and spot over an uncoupling ramp and then uncouple when they didn't want to. So they're all over the layout. They're still there. There's no way I'm going to get rid of them. And so what I've been doing now is cutting the hoses off of Katy couplers. Now some people say, no, you should leave those on because it kind of looks like a air hose. And if you put air hoses on, then it's obvious they're not hooked. But I can't have people uncoupling when they don't want to. So I wish I wouldn't have not done that. One thing that did work out really well is all of the toggles along the layout are for switch motors, most of them, and there's some others, but they're all color-coded. And if it has a red cap, then it means it's on a main line, so that's a switch for the main line. If it has a blue cap, then it's a switch somewhere else. And so it's very easy for operators who've never been here before. During the orientation, I point out that the red, when you leave an area, make sure all the red switches are lined for the main. And so it's also very easy for me to come in and just glance down a section of the layout and make sure that every single red one is pointed to the white, which means they're lined from the main, and correct those that someone forgot. They left a location and left it lined for the siding. So that's worked out really well. A few more things that worked out really well. Again, I was only renting this house, but I put in a new 50 amp circuit for just the layout room. No electrician. Actually, I work for the city of Newark, and I talked to a building inspector how to do it, and he told me how to do it, and I just plugged it in, wired it, and so that gives me all the power I needed for everything I've ever done in here, including an air compressor when I had an air compressor in here. After putting in the 50 amp circuit, what I did was I added a switch over on the far side of the wall that shut all power off to the room except for the lights. The lights are in another room, so you can get out of here and not trip. But when I come in, if I'm going to run the railroad or have visitors or whatever, I go over and flip that switch. That powers up the layout. Except that there's now two switches here and another one over here. One of them will turn on the DCC system. Another one turns on all the motors for the turnouts. Another one turns on the sound effects and things like that. The sound effects, I think, have really added a lot. You've got sound coming from the locomotive and so forth, but there's some other very, very subtle sounds in here. If you're over by the Merced River at El Portel, listen and you can hear the river. Every once in a while, a crow up in the ceiling, and people know where sounds are coming from. So it's up in the ceiling, and maybe every 5 minutes or something, you hear a crow way up in the distance. There's some other little sounds. I've had more in the past, but I think they're really effective for visitors. Now, operators probably don't care, but operators at times are standing around waiting for a time to leave, and they can enjoy the ambiance of what's going on. Another thing I did is I put 120 volt outlets at various places around the room, and that worked out really well. I wished I had put more in. At the time, I just had a little duplex, and I didn't even really have any need for them. Well, I did, because when I was building the layout, we didn't have cordless drills and so forth. So I would have to plug in my drill in order to use it. And so that was the main purpose. But now I put 6 plug adapters in all of them, and some of them I have 5 or 6 things plugged in. There's sound systems, there's extra lights, there's all kinds of stuff I never even thought about when I started. So it worked out really, really well. Another thing I did was I brought air from my air compressor into the layout room and put quick couplers at probably 5 or 6 places. Partly because with the scenery, I was using a static grass that was bright yellow, and I had to airbrush it. So this let me airbrush any portion of the layout with a 6-foot hose connected to the airbrush to take care of everything. Another thing that I did that worked out really well is when I started getting the scenery in and so forth, it was about the time that our office was still allowing people to smoke in the office, which in California, you can't even comprehend people smoking inside a building now. But at the time, it was allowed. And so what our boss did was he bought about 3 or 4 little air cleaners about this big, and they actually worked really well. They would supercharge whatever's coming into them, and that would be grabbed onto a filter. When either he said no more smoking in the office, or the state law came into effect that you couldn't do that, they became surplus, and I took them, and I had all 3 of them plugged in at various places, and I ran them 24/7. And that really took the dust out of the air. I used them for probably 30 years until I ran out of filters and you couldn't buy them anymore. So what I finally did, well, what my wife did, is for Christmas one year I got this big package about this big, and it was a HEPTA air filter. And so when I walk out of the room, I turn it on. When I come back in, I turn it off when people are here. And I've cleaned the scenery once in the 40 years or so, before a big open house, and I went around and I vacuumed all of the scenery and so forth. The water that gets dust on it, I don't think I've cleaned it for 2 or 3 years now. it just, these things really, really work. And the little ones I was using would be good for, one of them was good for a room that was 15 by 15 or something. We're in a 20 by 20 room. So 3 of them were cleaning the whole thing, every 20 minutes or something. So it's a really, really good investment when you get to the point where you've got scenery and buildings and you want to keep the dust off of them. Now I want to talk about equipment. And I've been very, very fortunate regarding equipment. When I started this layout, or started modeling the YV actually, I didn't have a locomotive appropriate for the YV. I did have a brass engine for a Santa Fe 280. I painted it, lettered up for the YV. Actually did an article on painting it. So I was okay with it. And sometime, many years later, the layout was started. I don't remember if I had scenery, but I noticed an ad in Railroad Model Craftsman for a YV caboose. And I didn't know anything about it. I wrote to the editor, and he said, well, the manufacturer was looking for a review, so if you'd like to do a review on it, that's what he wants. And so I got in touch with the guy. He lived about an hour away, and he brought up one of his cabooses, and he did a really, really good job. And so I got the feeling that if he was going to do a model of a prototype, he wanted to do it right. He'd worked for Westside. Westside had come out with a model for a Sierra engine that all the Sierra modelers realized was really, really not correct, and it didn't sell very well. And so this guy, when he went on his own, knew how the business ran and wanted to do things right. And so when he was here, I mentioned that if he ever wanted to do a YV 260, I had erection drawings for one of them. And so that got his attention. And so he started working toward that goal. And so I didn't really think he was going to do it. The YV is such a small prototype, he would never sell them. And so I got in touch with him, and this is all before the internet, sent him a letter and said, if you really do this 260, which was an Alco, I'd like to buy 3 of them because one was an Alco and the other 2 were Baldwins, and they all were very, very similar, with just a few differences. He wrote back and says, well, what were the differences? So I gave him a list, and he got in touch with the manufacturer in Korea and came back, and they said minimum order was 300, but the changes between all 3 were so minor that he could get 100 of each of those 3 and meet his 300 minimum order. So he ordered 100 of each of them. Then the pilot came in, and he brought it down and had me check the pilot over and make sure everything was right. So as soon as they arrived, my wife and I went up, and I bought 3 engines. And then she decided that she wanted to get the 3 painted engines. So that was $1,000 or more. And so then I talked to him about doing the other 260s. The first set all had piston valves. The other 2 had slide valves. And he came out with those. So one manufacturer gave me 5 of the 7 engines that were run on the YV. I still look at it and I think I was so lucky. And they sold out. You can occasionally find them on eBay or something. They're still being sold for about the same price they were originally, about $700. I also work with Al Westerfield, and he released a resin kit under the Westerfield model's name for, I think it was a 30-foot long pressed steel hopper car. And it was a sister to the 22-foot long hoppers that the YV ran. So I sent him a letter and said, if you want to come out with these 22-footers, I can give you plans, I can give you prototype photos, lettering, I can do the lettering for you, all the artwork. And he did. And the YV had 51 of these hoppers. So I bought 51 resin kits. I still have boxes available of them. I built one of them for a review for Model Railroad Craftsman, and then I built 10 of them at one time, which is as many as I could use on the layout. And that was a long struggle. Even with a precision drill press, I would do nothing but drill holes all evening long. So I finally got all 10 of those done, lettered and so forth. I've given away a few of the kits I have. I still have a stash of about at least 20 or more. Friends that know me have known me for a long time. If I've given a clinic and I mentioned something about the hopper cars, they love to yell out, "So, Jack, have you got all 51 of those hopper cars built?" Well, my answer these days is, I'm not that rushed because God won't take me until they're all done. And I envision getting all of them done and having a double header or a triple header and call my wife and say, "Come here, honey, look, all 51 of them," and then have a heart attack and die. I'll never build more. I just don't have any need for them, and that would just be painful. So I was also able to work with Eric Bracker. He saw this stock car, and it took us second place in nationals, I think, scratch built. YV had 3 of them. He asked about plans for them, and it came out with resin kits for them. I only bought 3, and I built 3. So I have all 3 of those done. And then he saw my first attempts at a log car. I needed some log cars for the logging section of the layout, which was a contest model. And so what I used was 40-foot long Tichy flat cars. I added a bulkhead. For the log bunks, I used ones from Grant Line, which were actually narrow gaugers, so they're not as long as they needed to be. But it worked for what I needed at the time. Eric Brackett comes over and sees them and decides he's going to do kits for those log cars. So I worked with him on that, gave him plans and so forth. I encouraged him to really, really use hot metal or white metal for the underbody because these cars are so light and there's no place to put extra weight, and he did that. So I think I bought 35. I still have a lot left. So I built 10 of them because that's as many as I could use on my layout. And a decade or two later, when I got into 3D printing, I was looking at them, and they were nice, but the bulkhead was solid white metal casting, and so it was too thick for my taste and so forth. So what I did is I 3D printed or 3D drafted bulkheads and insills, and actually the YV had 5 different variations of these cars. The first order had very short bulkheads. Then they were having a problem with logs going over the top of them, obviously, so they added an extension at the top. And then the next order was a little bit different and so forth. So I drew up all 5 variations. And so I went ahead and built 2 of them on the first variations. They're in the display case. I built 10 of them for operations on the layout, 5 with loads, 5 empties, plus a couple more. And I used his underbodies, and I still have kits of his left. But I'm done with log cars. The experience I had with the YV log cars was more of finding more information, better skills, becoming more critical and so forth. But I've also had issues with prototype non-YV freight cars, partly because when I got started, there wasn't a lot of information online or in magazine articles as there is now. So when I heard that IMWX had come in with a kit for a 1937 box car, and I'm modeling 1939, I immediately bought 3 kits. And I built the first kit, and then I got in touch with Richard Hendrickson because I wanted to know what prototype I should letter it for, because I just assumed that 1937 boxcars were built in 1937. It turns out the very first car that was built to that AAR standard was built by UP or for UP and delivered in May 1939. So I recognized that it would not be on the YV. It was a brand new car, so forth. So I gave it away, and I gave the 2 unbuilt kits away. That's kind of been the story of my life with these resin kits. I've had a lot of them, and for example, so I had a photo of a YV train that showed it had a couple gondola cars, and one of the manufacturers had come out with a kit for that, and so I immediately bought 2 of them and put them together because I had photographic proof that they were on the YV. Later, I learned that they were used in a mining operation that didn't start till 1944. So I sold them on eBay. So I also had a problem that I was buying resin kits for cars that I liked the looks of or that were unique. And so I built the cars, and then I became a little more critical and said, okay, that car is too far from home, it's too new, it's too rare, and those were sold on eBay. I'd also learned that tank cars on the YV tended to be UTLX tank cars, especially the 6,000 gallon ones. That time I was exchanging emails with Richard Hendrickson because Precision Scale had a kit for those cars, but it was narrow gauge. And what Richard finally realized or discovered was they were standard gauge cars that the Rio Grande bought and just put narrow gauge trucks under them. So that meant that we can use those kits because no one else had a kit for those cars. And they were very common on the YV. The YV had a distributor for Standard Oil at El Portel. All the gas stations in Yosemite National Park were Standard Oil, and UTLX was owned by Standard Oil. So they were using their own tank cars basically to transfer gasoline up to El Portel to be taken into the valley. So Richard did an article on them. The problem was that the trucks they needed were a 5-foot wheelbase AAR truck or something. I'm not up on that kind of stuff. And so he built one, did an article on it, and so I bought 6 of them, 6 kits, put them all together. They sat aside while I was pondering about doing those trucks, and I finally said, I just got to do this and get the right trucks on them. Got them all finished. A couple of years later, I thought, that's too many tank cars on the layout, so I sold 3 of them. Then there was another car that was a Seaboard car that Richard was over one time, and he was not the kind of person that would point something out that was critical of anybody. But what he did, he was looking around the layout, and then he wrote me a letter a week later and just shared the information with me that the emblem on that Seaboard car, it's a large emblem, was not in effect until 1953. So I sold that on eBay. Reefers, again, I was buying refrigerator cars that I liked the looks of, and I finally made myself realize that the YV interchanged with the Southern Pacific primarily, but also the Santa Fe. So they're not going to have reefers from some of these other national refrigerator car lines. So I sold all of those cars. I also had some kits that I finally realized I shouldn't have. For example, this 50-foot PFE car, it would not be on the YV. Another one was a kit for our ART, or American Refrigerator Transit, that had 1950 lettering. I missed that. What eventually helped is I was buying just about all my resin kits from Sunshine, and Martin Lofton at that time was coming out once a year to an annual rail fair event and selling kits. And he finally started remembering the year that I modeled. So I would have my list, maybe 4 or 5 brand new kits that he'd released, and I'd go up and I'd say, okay, I want this one, this one, this one. And then he would say, 1939, right? And he would pull out the one with the correct lettering. That's when things kind of turned around. I still have a stash of about 45 kits. I will build them sometime. Those I will build eventually, because I've weeded out the ones that I shouldn't have, and those are all gone and sold. So right now I have about 80 cars on the layout. 10 of them are rock cars, 10 of them are log cars. The rest are box cars and some refrigerators and my 3 tank cars. So out of all these cars, I run the same cars every single operating session. I reset them by simply picking them up and moving them. The cars that were here and went to El Portel, the next session, they move from El Portel down here. So all the other cars are just scenery. They don't run. Some of them have never run. I finish them, I weather them, I put them on the layout. As I build more of them, what I will do is swap them, because I've really kind of out of room for more freight cars. So the ones that have been around for a long time, I'll put aside. Some of them I have swapped out or sold just because I was tired of looking at them. I have so many cars now that some of the cars that I finish, especially maintenance away cars, I've got some of them on the layout, but I have some that I just don't have room for. And I've got one more to build. And so those go straight from the workshop into the display cases because I would never operate them during an operating session anyway. I've thought about what if I had another train that was an extra, maybe it was a maintenance away train, but there's basically no time that it can get from the lower level to the upper level when there wasn't a train going the other way. One thing I want to summarize is the most important decision I've ever made, the thing that worked extremely well, is picking a prototype and picking a year or a season. I love the research. I love making things correct. For example, selling freight cars that I shouldn't have owned is easy to do as I got more information on the prototype and what was going on at the time and so forth. And I freelanced for a while, and it was kind of I could do anything I wanted. And I actually had flat cars that were painted red, and the colors that would be inappropriate. Maybe it was a yellow one, I don't remember. But I felt I could do anything. It's my railroad. But I wasn't getting very much satisfaction for it. And by picking a prototype, I've been at this since 1980s when I started this layout, and it's finished, but I'm still really, really enjoying this hobby. It's just sucks me in. So with that, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.